On a stormy afternoon at the regional airport, a sable German shepherd K9 and an aging male airport security officer in his late 60s stood beside the yellow line on the floor. In his pocket lay an envelope of retirement papers he was meant to sign after this shift. Most days, they watched bags drift past. But today the dog stepped onto the painted stripe and refused to move. And as the old man's hand tightened on the envelope, he felt that, if the dog was right, leaving this line might cost more than he knew. He woke before the alarm again. The same thin slice of grey edging the blinds. The same silence pressing in around the little house. The heater clicked, sighed, and settled. Somewhere in the hallway, a faint tap sounded, like something brushing wood, then stopping just as his breathing changed. He lay still, listening, telling himself it was only the house shifting on an old foundation. When he swung his legs out of bed, one slipper had been nudged away from the other, angled toward the front door. It had happened 3 mornings in a row now. He stared at the odd gap between them, feeling that small, unreasonable prickle at the back of his neck. "You're getting jumpy, Hank," he muttered, and slid his feet in as if that settled it. In the kitchen, the old linoleum held a dull shine from the nightlight over the sink. A narrow trail of faint marks crossed it curved, repeating, too soft for boot treads. He rubbed at one with his socked toe and felt the slight roughness, as if something with weight and rhythm had passed through before dawn. Must be his own steps, he decided, though they didn't quite match. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the quiet with a low, familiar hum. As he waited, he sensed movement behind him, the shift of air near his hip, a warmth that wasn't from the vent. He turned quickly, heart ticking higher, but the doorway behind him was empty. Only the hanging coats and his security vest on the hook. "You're hearing ghosts," he said, trying to laugh. By the front window, the blinds were parted by the width of a finger, just enough to show the street lamp outside and the empty driveway. He remembered closing them all the way the night before. His hand hovered over the cord, his chest tighter than the small thing warranted. Maybe Head left them like that himself, distracted, off in his own head. Maybe, as he set his travel mug on the counter, the floorboard by the hallway let out a soft, familiar creak, the same one that had sounded in the dark before he woke. It came once, then again, a measured weight moving from shadow toward the front door. He froze, feeling his pulse thrum in his ears, and then silence settled as neatly as if someone had taken position and stayed there. He stepped into the hall. The faint scent that met him was neither cologne nor coffee, something warm, edged with the trace of outside air and old nylon. His jacket on the chair bore a scatter of short, pale hairs he didn't remember brushing off last night. He plucked one free, rolling it between his fingers, a memory rising that he refused to name this early. At the door, the mat was pressed down in a clean oval, as if some steady weight had just been there. Facing outward, Hank stood staring at that impression, keys in his hand, a ripple of unease running through the quiet morning. Whatever had once stood watch here, some part of it seemed to be on duty still. Following a routine his mind insisted was finished. Chapter 2. Patterns on the Threshold. When he opened the door, cold dawn air slid in, along with a sound he knew better than his own name. The soft staccato of nails on the porch boards. A shape moved past his leg, low and confident, then sat just outside the frame, gazing toward the street as if accounting for every parked car. Hank's breath eased despite himself. So it wasn't only memory after all. Morning. Ranger, he said, and the shepherd's ears flicked back at the name. The animal didn't turn, only tracked the empty road, chest expanding with quiet breaths. Every morning, the same time, the step into the hall, the wait by the door, the scan of the street as if a siren might wail any second. Hank told himself it was just leftover training, muscle memory in four-legged form. As he locked up, the collar gave a tiny jingle, the sound slipping straight under his ribs. Ranger padded ahead to the truck, circling it once before, stopping with his nose pointed at the driver's door. Hank paused, watching the deliberate pattern. You know this route better than I do, he murmured, then shook his head at how foolish that sounded. It was only habit. Only habit. The drive to the airport cut through flat fields rimmed with bare trees. In the passenger seat, Ranger sat upright, eyes scanning fence rows and crossroads, occasionally leaning forward when they passed a state trooper's car. Hank's fingers tightened on the wheel. We're just screening luggage these days, he reminded them both. No more chasing down calls in the rain. The shepherd's steady gaze made him doubt his own words. Inside the employee entrance, fluorescent lights painted everything a pale blue. Ranger's nails clicked on the polished floor as they walked. Near the main checkpoint, a thick stripe of paint marked the boundary. The yellow security line on the floor. Every shift, Ranger slowed there, sniffing along the edge, then lifting his head to study the river of travellers on the other side. Hank noticed how the shepherd's muscles tensed, how his breathing sharpened just a fraction. A woman rolled a suitcase past. A man adjusted a sleeping child on his shoulder. A businessman checked his watch. Ranger didn't move, only watched, then glanced back at Hank, as if waiting for a call that never came. Hank told himself he was imagining that question in the animal's eyes. They joined the other teams near the checkpoint. Handlers in dark uniforms, animals in harnesses marked for the unit. As they took their place along the belt, Ranger did something he'd done every day for a month now. Once the line cleared for a moment, he stepped forward to the yellow security line on the floor, touched his nose to it, then sat right behind it, gaze searching. "Ranger, back," Hank said softly, giving the hand signal. The shepherd obeyed, but not before one last look down the concourse, toward where the gates opened and closed like distant mouths. Hank felt the echo of an old unease stirring. Why that line? Why that particular stretch of floor? Every single time, as if it marked something more than paint and policy. Chapter 3. Years on the Line. Long before the little regional airport and its soft announcements, there had been fields cut into squares by orange cones and tape. Hank remembered the training grounds in the next state over, the wind that whipped across them, the scent of trampled grass and sweat. Ranger had been young then, fur dark and sleek, eyes bright with restless energy that seemed to vibrate through the leash. They'd walked grid after grid under floodlights, following instructions barked through a bullhorn. Hank learned to read the smallest changes, the way Ranger's tail stiffened, the sudden deep inhale, the shift from casual curiosity to focused drive. Night after night, they followed trails through abandoned warehouses, along riverbanks, through mock terminals laid out with taped lines and cardboard luggage shapes. What stuck with him most weren't the staged explosives or training hides. It was the silence afterward, when everyone had gone and he'd sit on the tailgate while Ranger panted beside him, steam rising from their breath into the cold. The animal would rest his head on Hank's knee, as if to say the night's work was done for now. Hank had never felt less alone than in those moments. Real calls came later. There was the crowded county fair, the freight yard after a leak scare, the high school game where they checked the stands under stadium lights. Most nights ended in nothing more than paperwork and yawns. But once, there was the train station 3 towns over, the one with the narrow platforms and the freshly painted caution stripe that looked too much like the yellow security line on the floor at the airport. He remembered the rush of people evacuated onto the street out front, the sharp smell of metal and oil, the flash of emergency lights bouncing off windows. Ranger had strained toward the cordoned-off entrance, nose working the air, nails scraping the concrete when Hank held him back. Orders were orders. They were to sweep the outer areas, stay behind the tape until the all clear. Later, they learned a woman hadn't made it out, trapped deeper inside when smoke from a small electrical fire flooded a stairwell. When the report reached Hank, he thought of how Ranger had whined just once at the tape, then sat down behind that painted line. eyes locked on the doors. He had followed instructions, but that painted stripe had burned itself into both their memories. After that, any boundary stripe on a street, in a warehouse, at a stadium caught Ranger's attention. Head slow. Check. Sometimes sit just behind it, as if listening for something Hank couldn't hear. The supervisors called it a quirk, a harmless pattern as long as it didn't interfere with work. Hank nodded, but deep down he carried a quiet weight. Had they ignored a warning that night at the station? Years thinned the dark in Ranger's coat and threaded silver through Hank's hair. Younger teams joined, all sharp edges and quick strides. They talked retirement plans and second careers, tossing around words like consulting and teaching. Hank pretended to join in, but whenever he pictured walking away, all he could see was Ranger staring at some painted line, waiting, and no one there to interpret it. Eventually, budget changes rolled through like a slow storm. The unit shifted from roaming calls to airport duty, to quieter, routine screens. Good way to wind down, his lieutenant had said. Hank agreed aloud. Inside, he watched his partner adjust to the bright concourses and vacationers, noting how the animal's focus never fully relaxed whenever a boundary stripe crossed the floor. On the day he signed the transfer papers, Ranger sat beside his chair, gaze fixed on the doorway rather than the officer behind the desk. The leash lay slack across Hank's hand, yet he felt tethered more tightly than ever to old mistakes, to unspoken fears, to the sense that some unfinished task still waited just beyond a line they hadn't yet crossed. Chapter 4. The First Clear Signal. In the weeks that followed, the new schedule settled around them like a coat that mostly fit. Early mornings, checkpoint rhythms, lunch in the break room with lukewarm coffee. Ranger learned the soundscape of the terminal. Rolling suitcases, overhead chimes, children's laughter, the low murmur of announcements. Yet every shift began and ended the same way nose along the yellow security line on the floor. A pause, a sit. One drizzly afternoon, traffic was light. The concourse washed in flat grey light from the big windows. Hank stood near the belt, chatting idly with another handler about the forecast, when he felt a gentle pressure at his thigh. Ranger had stepped close, pressing his shoulder against Hank's leg with unusual insistence. The shepherd's eyes flicked from Hank to the supervisor's office door down the hall. "What is it, boy?" Hank asked. Habit, using the old word before he caught himself. Ranger moved away, trotting down the hall with a quick, purposeful gait, then stopping squarely in front of the office door. He sat, then lay down across the threshold, head on his paws, as if barring passage. The door itself was slightly ajar, fluorescent lights spilling into the hallway. Hank followed, embarrassed to be pulled away from his post by what might be nothing more than restlessness. "Ranger." "Up," he said, but the shepherd only thumped his tail once and stayed put. From inside the office came the low murmur of two voices. On the desk beyond, Hank knew, lay the folder with his retirement packet half completed, waiting for him to sign the last page. He stood there longer than he meant to, feeling his heartbeat in his throat. The dog's body was warm against the cool tile, chest rising and falling steadily. Hank imagined stepping over him, going in, finishing what had started. Instead, he found himself backing away. "Another day," he muttered. Ranger rose, gave a short exhale, almost like relief, and padded back toward the checkpoint. That night at home, the pattern repeated in a quieter form. As Hank reached for the small stack of mail on the kitchen table, Ranger nosed aside the envelopes until a particular one slid free a glossy brochure from the retirement office. All smiling couples on decks overlooking lakes. The shepherd placed a paw on it, pinning it to the table, eyes resting on Hank's face. Hank laughed, but the sound was thin. "You advocating for or against this?" he asked. Ranger moved his paw, then nudged the brochure off the table entirely, letting it fall face down on the floor. Then he walked to the front door and sat where the mat bore that familiar oval impression, gaze steady on the handle as if waiting for a call. Later, as wind rattled the gutters, Hank dozed in his armchair with the television low. He woke to feel weight at his feet. Ranger curled there, chin resting on Hank's boot, something he hadn't done since the days they'd waited for late-night pages. Hank's chest tightened with an old, half-forgotten comfort. It felt less like the end of a career and more like someone quietly insisting they weren't finished yet. When he finally turned out the lights, Ranger walked the hallway once, nails ticking on the boards, then settled by the door, head lifted toward the quiet street. Hank watched the silhouette for a long time before going to bed, a sense growing in him that his partner was not simply clinging to habit. He was pointing at something Hank had not yet understood. The storm rolled in on a Friday when the departures board was already a mosaic of delays. Rain streaked the tall windows, turning runway lights into blurred halos. Inside, the terminal felt crowded and compressed, lines doubling back on themselves, voices edging toward impatience. Hank could feel the tension like static in the air as he clipped Ranger's harness and stepped into position near the checkpoint. Thunder muttered somewhere far off, barely audible over the rolling suitcases and announcement chimes. Ranger's ears flicked once, then settled, his attention narrowing. They worked the line as usual, weaving between travellers, Hank's hand light on the leash. He watched the shepherd's body language, the routine sniffs at bags, the brief, dismissive exhale that meant no interest, the steady pace that spoke of long practice. Near midday, a gap opened in the crowd. For a moment, the area between the metal detector and the roped-off queue lay oddly clear. There, halfway across, sitting alone and slightly askew, was an unattended piece of luggage, a small blue tote bag. Its straps slumped toward the polished floor, one just brushing the yellow security line on the floor like a fingertip. Hank felt his shoulders tense. He signaled to the nearest officer, then to Ranger, who had already fixed on the site. The shepherd approached with measured, almost reverent steps, nose working the air. Hank's training rose in him like a script. Control your breathing. Observe the animal. Follow procedure. Yet, as Ranger neared the small blue tote bag, something in his posture looked different, less sharp threat, more wary recognition. The shepherd circled once, then again, tracing a careful loop that brushed the edge of the yellow security line on the floor. On the second pass, he paused, inhaled deeply along the side facing the concourse, and then, with deliberate certainty, he sat down. His tail lay still behind him, eyes lifted not at the bag itself, but down the corridor beyond, where gate numbers glowed above clustered passengers. Hank's mouth went dry. A sit was an alert, clear, trained behavior. Procedure dictated immediate escalation, evacuation. The chain of calls he knew by heart. Yet the scent Ranger was trained to detect had a particular effect on him. Heightened energy, quick glances, the kind of contained excitement that signaled a find. This stillness felt different, heavy with some other knowledge. He doubted his own instincts and hated that doubt. Supervisors converged, radios crackling. The area around the small blue tote bag was cleared in a widening circle, yellow tape appearing almost instantly, echo of that long-ago train station. Passengers were redirected, some filming on their phones until asked not to. Rain hammered harder against the windows, turning the world outside into a sheet of grey. Ranger remained seated, gaze unwavering. Anything else from him? The lieutenant asked quietly. Hank watched the shepherd's slow, deep breaths, the slight twitch of an ear whenever a particular announcement repeated. A final boarding call for a delayed flight at Gate 12. Hez locked on something. Hank replied, voice low. But I don't think it's what we usually see. Saying that felt like breaking a rule. Bomb techs arrived with their equipment, moving with practiced caution. As they prepared to examine the tote, A shout went up from down the concourse, someone calling for help near the glass wall by the windows. A woman in a bright raincoat was half kneeling, half crouched beside a figure slumped on a bench, a carry-on bag at his feet and a jacket tangled in his lap. For a heartbeat, everyone seemed to look both ways at once. Ranger broke his sit. He stood, muscles coiled, and gave a low, urgent sound Hank heard only on real emergencies, not training fields. Then he did something entirely outside protocol. He stepped over the yellow security line on the floor and pulled hard toward the commotion. Leash taut. Hank had a split second to choose between holding him back, guarding the tote, or following that unmistakable pull. His supervisor's voice reached him. Stay with the bag. Hank. But Ranger's eyes met his, an echo of that night at the train station burning there. The small blue tote bag sat alone, tape already forming a perimeter around it. Down the concourse. The woman's voice cracked as she called again for help. Hank felt the old weight of unfinished things pressing in, and knew he could no longer stand still on this side of any line. Hank tightened his grip and said the one word that had always meant partnership. Not command. Together. Then he followed Ranger over the yellow security line on the floor, radio bouncing at his hip. Behind him, someone swore under their breath, but no one physically stopped them. The shepherd moved with intent, weaving through clusters of passengers who parted instinctively at the sight of the harness. As they neared the bench by the windows, the shape on it resolved. A man in his 70s, grey hair plastered damply to his forehead, skin gone a worrying shade. His head lolled against the glass, eyes half closed. The woman in the raincoat looked up, relief flashing across her face when she saw the uniform. He just slumped over. She said he felt funny. Then this. Ranger planted himself at the man's knees, nose close to his hands, breathing in short, focused bursts. Then he shifted, nudging the carry-on aside until Hank saw what lay partly hidden between the bench leg and the man's shoe. A folded boarding pass and a matching claim tag for checked baggage, a tag bearing the same name and flight number that matched the unattended small blue tote bag still sitting by the checkpoint. In Hank's ear, the radio crackled with updates about the suspicious item. Bomb techs had begun their scan, following protocol, while he knelt beside the stranger. Training from long ago mandatory classes surfaced through his jitters. Check responsiveness, airways, pulse. The man's wrist felt cool and slick under Hank's fingers, pulse thready and uneven. "Sir, can you hear me?" Hank asked. A faint sound escaped, more exhale than word. Ranger made a soft, insistent noise. then bumped his nose against the man's chest, just above the pocket of his shirt. Hank glanced down and saw the edge of a medical bracelet peeking out from the cuff. The letters too small to read in that instant. He thought of the shepherd's unusual calm by the tote. The way Head sat, not with tense excitement, but with a grave steadiness. "Get medics here now." Hank called into his radio, voice firmer than he felt. Possible cardiac event at the window seating by B gates. Elderly male. Semi-responsive. Head barely finished when Ranger stepped sideways, placing himself between Hank and the gawking crowd that had begun to gather, creating a small pocket of space around them. It was a move more protective than tactical. Minutes stretched like rubber bands, thin and trembling. The rain outside softened as first responders arrived, their gear bags thumping against the floor. Hank moved back but stayed close, hand still looped loosely in Ranger's leash. As paramedics worked, one of them glanced at the medical bracelet and nodded. "Hez got a history," she said quietly. Lucky someone noticed this fast. While they stabilized the man, a supervisor hurried over, expression tight. "Bags clear," he said, almost as an afterthought. "Just some personal items and medication. Nothing dangerous." He looked from Hank to Ranger. Wide he alert. Hank swallowed, watching as paramedics lifted the stranger onto a gurney. The shepherd's gaze stayed glued to the man's face, not the tote. Maybe he didn't. Hank answered slowly. Not to the bag, at least. Maybe to what was missing from it. The supervisor frowned, but Hank went on, words surprising even himself. Same name, same flight as that gentleman. Meds in the tote. Patient here. Maybe my partner decided the bigger risk wasn't in the luggage. It sounded improbable aloud, yet felt exactly right. Later, in a quiet corner of the break room, Hank sat with Ranger's head heavy on his thigh. Reports would be written, boxes checked, some questions never fully answered. But the image that stayed with him was the moment Ranger had stepped over the yellow security line on the floor without waiting for permission. Eyes locked not on a threat, but on a life slipping toward danger. He realized then what had been gnawing at him since the train station years ago. Lines on floors, strips of tape, painted warnings. They marked where people said safety ended. Ranger had always treated them as something else. Reminders that the real work was often on the far side. His patterns, his sits behind stripes, his refusal to let Hank sign those retirement papers, all of it pointed toward one quiet truth. They were not done. But their mission had changed. The next day, Hank sat in the supervisor's office with the retirement folder open between them. He slid the unsigned pages back. He'd like to adjust the request. He said, not to leave, to shift roles. He glanced down at Ranger, stretched across the doorway like before, but this time in easy rest. Let us teach. Let us be the ones who tell the new teams that sometimes the line you step over isn't about danger. It's about not walking away when someone still needs you. Spring came slowly to the flat land around the airport, softening the edges of the runways with patches of greener grass and warmer light. Hank's schedule changed along with the season. Fewer hours standing at the checkpoint, more time in the training wing, where fresh-faced handlers listened as he told stories that had nothing to do with heroics and everything to do with paying attention. Ranger lay nearby, thumping his tail whenever a point landed. They used the training concourse for demonstrations. A strip of paint marked off an area on the polished floor, a replica of the yellow security line on the floor outside. Sometimes, for exercises, they'd set an empty bag behind it. Other days, Hank would ask a volunteer to sit just beyond, feigning distress. Ranger, a veteran now, walked the line with his easy, measured gait, showing the younger dogs what focused calm looked like. On a shelf in the corner of the room, among cones and leashes and spare harnesses, sat a familiar object, the small blue tote bag. The owner, recovered and grateful, had insisted Hank keep it when he returned to thank the team weeks later. Now it served as a reminder that not every alert was about something that could explode. Sometimes it was about something that might quietly fade away if no one noticed. Outside of work, Hank found his evenings less heavy. He and Ranger developed a new ritual. After dinner, they'd walk the quiet streets of his neighborhood. The shepherd's pace slower now, but still purposeful. They'd pause at crosswalks where faded stripes met asphalt, watching the play of headlights and shadows. Hank found himself greeting neighbors he'd only nodded to before, sharing small stories about an aging partner who still insisted on making rounds. On occasional afternoons off, they visited the terminal not as sentries, but as a kind of welcome committee. Children asked to pet Ranger, and with permission and a gentle hand on the harness, they did. Older travellers lingered to hear that he'd spent years on duty. Some told their own tales of service, of partners long gone. Hank listened, feeling less alone with each story woven into the hum of the concourse. The yellow security line on the floor remained a boundary, but its meaning had softened. Ranger still paused there at the start of each visit, touching his nose briefly to the paint before moving on, as if tipping his hat to all the days they'd stood watch. Hank would touch it too with the edge of his shoe, a private acknowledgement that they had once been held back by such markings and had learned, together, when crossing them was the truest form of duty. Most nights ended the same way now. Ranger curled on the mat by the door. Hank in his armchair with a book he sometimes read and sometimes simply held. The house felt less haunted and more inhabited. Its creaks and sighs part of a familiar song. Outside, the world moved at its own hurried pace. Inside, two old partners kept a quieter rhythm, the kind that comes after long roads and hard choices, when one understands the value of simply staying. Years later, the airport added new scanners and brighter lights, the way places do when time rolls on. Hank cut back his hours, easing into a retirement that no longer felt like abandonment. Ranger's muzzle had gone almost entirely white, and his steps up the porch had grown slower, but his eyes still tracked the comings and goings on their street with steady interest. Some mornings, Hank would drive out to the terminal even when he wasn't on the schedule, just to sit with a cup of coffee near the training wing. New teams worked the floor where the yellow security line on the floor gleamed freshly painted. Now and then, a handler would spot him and wave him over, asking him to tell the story behind the small blue tote bag on the shelf. He always did. Voice soft but clear. At home, a framed photo hung by the door. Ranger in harness, sitting tall beside that same stripe, Hank's hand resting on his shoulder. Next to it, on a little hook, hung the old leash they no longer used every day. Kids from the neighborhood learned that if they knocked and asked politely, they might be allowed to walk the old shepherd slowly down the block, under Hank's watchful eye. In the evenings, when the sun set low and turned the living room walls the color of warm brass, Hank would sometimes find his gaze drifting to the narrow strip of light under the front door. Ranger would be there, as always, stretched on the mat, one paw just touching that line of brightness. It struck Hank how many boundaries in life were like that thin, bright marks between fear and action, between staying put and stepping through. On their last winter working any sort of duty at all, Hank brought Ranger to the airport one quiet weekday, more as a guest than a member of the unit. They walked once more to the checkpoint, stopped at the yellow security line on the floor, and stood there together. Ranger touched his nose to the paint, then leaned gently against Hank's leg. Hank rested his hand on the aging neck and smiled. They had crossed many lines in their time, some painted, some not. What remained now was simple and enough. Shared watchfulness, a life reshaped by loyalty, and the quiet knowledge that because one old shepherd had refused to ignore a pattern, neither of them would ever stand uselessly on the wrong side of a line again. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.